You are listening to Be the Change, a podcast of conversations with true visionaries who are creating new paradigms for a healthier planet and society. I am your host, Christine Dimick, and my work is in finding real solutions to the biggest problems we face today: climate crisis, capitalism, social injustices, and our failing health. There are amazing humans out there that have answers, and it is my mission to have their voices heard. Together, we can raise consciousness and create a just and equal society. Together, we can be the change. There is so much action and effort to get kids vaccinated and back into school for their mental health. But who is tending to the mental wounds they suffered from being home the past year and a half? Do parents and guardians even see it? Today, I am joined by Seth Kritzman, an adjunct instructor at Fordham GSC and a New York City guidance counselor for a public school in Manhattan. He and his colleagues see firsthand the effects isolation has had on our children, and there's a great concern this will be a scar they will carry with them for years to come. So how can we help them adjust? And what will a future society look like led by children of the pandemic? And is it really a good idea to continue a work-from-home policy? These are just a few of the questions we will touch on today. Join us in discussing, are the kids really all right? Welcome, Seth, and thank you for being the change and being on today.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So for everyone listening, this topic came up between Seth and I on one day about how the kids are doing. And we were talking about my son, Rome, who Seth knows, and he was, I was saying how well adjusted he was, right? Like how he's so excited back in high school, and like, I just couldn't be happier. And I was shocked to kind of hear what the difficulties are you're experiencing in middle school, and that this is really widespread. And then Seth, literally a week later, it was like Gotham had covered it. And now I got this email from the school, right? That they're going to be checking on our kids' mental health, and that they have, it's called the CEL.
Yeah, or the DESA is the other term. I think that's the name of the actual screener.
And so while I realized in discussing this with you is that I'm one of the lucky few, and that actually there may be residue that Rome is carrying around, or that all our kids are carrying around, that we don't know about it. Can you share with us some of the issues that you're seeing and what you're dealing with?
Sure. I mean, I think some of this is to be expected. At least we expected it, but not to the intensity and the constantness of it. There's just a lot of, from the simple things of how do we sit near somebody else, or how do we be in the classroom with 30 people that we haven't seen in over a year, to just not making the connection between switching from online to real life and seeing real people in front of you, a real teacher and everything else, and the way the words impact us. But when you put something in a chat versus saying it in person, or when you're on a chat and then having to face that person the next day, there's a lot of issues around that. And then there's just navigating the physical space. If you somebody bumps into you, is it intentional? And then how do you react to that in that moment? And you don't have the space that you have in the virtual space to be able to not react, or just to block somebody, or to leave them on red and not respond to. There's all these things that we're navigating. So there's that. And then there's just the pressure of a regular school day again, of waking up early. So people are more tired, and then not going to bed at the right time, or before, where you could go to bed later and then wake up and roll out of bed and just log onto your classroom camera off. Now you have to be in a building. You're supposed to sit upright. You can't eat or drink when you want. There's all these things that happened over the past year and a half that people are really adjusting to, and kind of were thrusted into it. I think we all knew it was coming, but at the same time, it's hard to prepare until you're actually living it. So
all these little things. So I can imagine that it's causing your day to day. And so parents are back to work, and they're oh, thank God, my kids are in school. So many. I mean, I have one child, so I can't imagine having three and having been in isolation and what that was like, and I also have one who's, he's older now, so he can manage things on his own. But I can see that the kids were used to having well, why can't I drink anymore? Or why can't I do this? And what I thought was really interesting that adults do as well is this kind of etiquette that you were saying. Like, it was so easy to write and type things in a text or these like rageful, it's like email rage, right? But then when you actually have to show up and see that person the next day, it's a whole different story.
Exactly. Well, I think it's also just like saying it in like a chat or online and then like not understanding that coming in the next day and being like, hey, how are you? And the person upset with you. And it's like, why are they upset with me? And relive that every day. It's like, well, I said that yesterday, or I said it online. I don't know why they're feeling this way now. And it's like, no, your words have power, whether they're online or in person. And I think it's easier to be more bold when you're online, when you have to like deal with the immediate response or like the facial expression or the energy of that, the repercussions of those words. In person, it's different. And people are more responsible, I think, in person than they are online. And some of that is normal adolescent development, and it's just the testing this out. But some of it, I think, has been exacerbated by the fact that we have been allowed to be isolated for so long and only deal with the people that we've been isolated for so long.
Yeah. Or deal with the people that we're most comfortable with, as they say, that you wouldn't treat strangers the way you treat most of your family, right? When you're close with them. And then now you it's losing that, I don't want to say manners, but I guess it is like how you relate to other people and being on your best behavior and, kind of, I don't know, I guess, maybe people got lazy and the whole world changed.
Well, I think some of it was just like, when you said people that you're most comfortable with, I think our sense of community has shifted and like what our definition of community is, because the community that you like knew before the pandemic or like before the world like changed on March of 2020 is different than the community that you like associate with. Like at first we kind of all hunkered down and like you stayed in your apartment, you had like your family, and then you slowly like expanded that circle that are just kind of in that same community. And I think that's the difficult part that we're dealing with right now.
And I think we also forget that not everyone has a great home life.
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone's home is filled with food and joy. And, there's a lot of difficulties going on. And I know even if there wasn't, to say that your relationship wasn't stressed during this time would be a lie. Right?
Right. Well, and I think a couple of things is that like one, people had this time away very differently. Some people, like their home life, they were isolated in their home, like not having been able to leave for months at a time, maybe only grocery shopping, and other people sort of living a very great unscheduled life, being able to be in homes with more space or being able to be out there and like do activities that they didn't get to do. They're like what they wouldn't normally get to do during the school year, have school from anywhere, right? Like not have to be in New York anymore. And I think part of it is like challenging when you come back together and you're like, okay, now we're all back in the same space and we all have to like work together. Whereas some people are very excited to be here because they came from they weren't in a great situation. Other people are like, well, I had a great time. I don't really want to be back here. And then how do you match that tenor? Like get people all on the same page is difficult. And like, it all has to happen at the same time. You're doing that as well as we're back to like the schedule and everything else. So it's like, there's not enough, it's hard. And like with adolescents, the other last thing I was going to say with adolescents, this is a time when you don't want to be with your parents. Like this is the time that you're supposed to be like pushing that independence. And that is the normal thing. But the first time you weren't allowed to like do that. You had to be like with your parents. And you're like, wow, like this is not what I want to be doing at all. And so
yeah. I wonder, do you think that was more in girls than boys, or do you see that as a 50-50 or?
I think it can manifest itself in different ways. Like I think for what I will say from like anecdotally from my experience, boys had it different. They had an outlet through video games and they had that community through video games and they could chat and they could like lock themselves in there. Whereas like girls can definitely play video games and they had that same thing, but it didn't seem to like fulfill them in the same way as like it fulfilled some of our boy students.
Those who identify as male. Yeah. My son did spend a lot of time. The thing that I was concerned about with him going back was his attention span. One was whether he was going to be able to like hold that and sit in the classroom and not fidget. He did come home with a lot of like the erasers ripped off the top, like, because it's like sitting into a lecture, he went straight into high school. So his periods they're 70-minute classes. It's not 30 minutes or 40. So I think attention. And then the other thing I noticed with a lot of the kids is the mask wearing and the concern about getting sick or about catching something or about being safe. The idea of safety. We've worked a lot at home, what safety means, right? Because it's kind of like the wild, wild west out there, or at least it felt like that, and I think for parents too.
I mean, I think this is true for adults as well as people with different comforts, and some people are more risk adverse. And so some kids are very comfortable and really resist the mask, and other kids are much more frightful and will have 2 masks on, or maybe because their parents really reiterate that. And I think that masks are great and they protect us from many diseases, but there's also the downside of it. Another way to depersonalize the person sitting next to you, because you're really only seeing their eyes and you really maybe don't know. And I think that's challenging. And then you can't, for some people who don't speak as loudly, or their volume, it can be harder to hear them too. And then there's a frustration that builds because nobody's able to understand you. And then how do you get that out? So there is I think in the beginning, we had students who were a little bit more nervous, but it feels as the days go on, it gets better and people are letting their guard down. I definitely, there's a lot more mask reminders happening now than there were in the beginning of the year. But I think it's hard because I don't know what everybody's experience coming into school and from their home is very, very different.
Yeah. And it's hard to sometimes remember that. I have moments just when you're sitting, I'm sure you have this all the time, and you're wearing the mask and you're talking to people, and then you just suddenly kind of step out of your body and look around and you're like, oh my God, I'm living in a world where we're all walking around with masks, talking to each other. And it's just the heaviness of it, I guess, hits me, and you're just how sad that we can't see, like you said, our friends smiling or laughing. But then you think, oh, they're kids, they're resilient, but it's not always. I guess, Seth, how can we tell if our kid is struggling? Are there signs that we should look for?
I mean, I think it's anything. There are things if their frustration tolerance is lower, if they see them getting more agitated, more frustrated, easier, or things that, energy level shifts, right? If I think that's a big one, or any big mood swings or changes in behavior tend to be the thing, or something that seems to bring someone joy before you're oh, there's something you really enjoyed, and all of a sudden they don't care. Those are signs. I think one thing that see in school is you enjoyed going to lunch or something like that, you would not be alone in that way. And now you see them drifting backwards, or not with their group, or they're disconnected. It's a concern. I think the other part that makes it really hard is that something that I have seen and heard a lot this year is that they're disconnected from their peers in person, but they have a whole friend group or social support network online. And that is where all their energy is. And people that they may not have met, or they may never meet, and that live in different parts of the world, in different countries and everything else. And they don't know, but that's what's supporting them. And they look withdrawn in person, but then it seems like a good support network to them. I think there's other issues, there are flags that I would raise to me but that is something else that happens too. So it's hard to say what is any shift in behavior. I think we probably should have a conversation. And I think that's the way to do it, is just to be in tune and not force conversation, but definitely try to have open channels. Things could be fine. You alluded to it earlier, with your son, it could be fine. And then all of a sudden, something happens and it's just everything comes crumbling down. And I don't think we can put a time limit on that, or we just don't know. So it's kind of always being vigilant and noticing any shift in behavior or changes in patterns or anything like that.
And long term, I would imagine, because I think, again, it's adolescence, right? So there's times he comes home and he's just shot and he's lays in his bed and just stares at his phone, which is, but I guess I used to lay in bed and watch TV. It's how long that lasts. And I know he's tired and he just had a long day. And it's also, that's another thing, physically, we haven't even discussed that. Kids are laying around for a year and a half, or for the most part. Now, I was real careful for his after school activities. I didn't throw him right into it, let him kind of tell me. And that's, my son, I know my son, and I know he's going to do that, right? Because you could overschedule your kid, but for me, like it was an extra effort just getting up and going to the grocery store.
Right. And it's like building up. We have to build up our endurance like with anything. And I think it's hard. And I think the inclination can be, and it's not easy, right? There's no like manual. This is how you build up for your child. You're supposed to like do like 2 hours one week and then you can extend it to 3 and extend it to 4. Like that's not human behavior. That's not how people work. And you really have to like know your family, know your child. And that takes a lot of work too. But I think like having a constant conversation around that, or constantly like looking at that and like checking in and being like, hey, do you want to do something more of this, something else? Or maybe try this. You seem to really enjoy this, and like that. But it is hard to build that endurance too, I think. And we can have good weeks and bad weeks, and good days and bad days, and good mornings and bad afternoons. I think that's hard, and so it can feel like, I think one thing that I'll say is families want to know, like, how do I know? Like, how do I do? Am I doing this right? Am I doing it right? And I can't get a read on this. And it's like, that is a challenge, but you can't dip your like toe in the water and be like, okay, it's cold. That's it. And now I'm like done. I never have to like feel it again. You kind of have to like constantly keep taking the temperature and have like established lines of communication and established, not like formal check-ins, but like just ways to like monitor and to check in to see how things are going. Because I will say like the beginning of the year was a big lift, right? Like we were just beginning and everything was being thrown at you at the same time and everything else. And like, hopefully now that things are like evening out, but maybe the evening out part is really challenging. And that's going to part of the time when things fall apart. It is not easy. And like, you wish that like, you feel for it. It's not an easy time to be a parent through all this too. And so you feel really, it's hard. It's hard for everybody. And I think parents try to be strong for their children, but that's hard. And it's a big ask of adults. Yeah, it's a big ask.
Yeah. As you're discussing that, I was just reminded when I was younger, my mom was a single mom and she was just working all the time, and I just, listen, we won't, that's a whole other episode. We won't go into what I did as an adolescent, but I will say that I think a lot of it was extra. And I will say, I think that a lot of it was preventable or wouldn't have happened if someone was asking me how I was doing. I didn't have anyone doing that. My mom came home around 8:00 at night. I'm not holding that against her, but there was no one asking me how my day went, what I was involved in. None of it. Right. I just said, I'm going to go to Lisa's house and spend the night. Okay. And that was fine. And I was 15 or whatever. And meanwhile, I was in New York City at a dance club at Danceteria dancing with Madonna. So funny now, but if my son did that, I would be mortified. And my husband's like that, also a wild, teenage years or whatever. So anyhow, we both come from the part that you can't ask too much.
Right. Well, I think school has shifted a lot from like when you were in school, and you and I were both in school, like to now. It was like, as long as there were grades and you were showing up to school, like people were like, okay, that's fine. They don't really worry about you. You weren't causing trouble and everything else. Where now we've like shifted to a greater awareness around the importance of social emotional wellness and learning that has to occur. And it's not something that can be you can't just assume people know how to do these things. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the opportunity that we have here in this time, is like, these things have been happening for a while, but I think this is a good time to like reevaluate and really look at like what skills need to be retaught, or what skills do our children need in order to like come through this stronger and come through this as more whole than they started. Because it's not an easy ask, but I do think kids are resilient, and if given the right support, and they can come out stronger and better in some ways too.
We're having this conversation from a place of privilege. And how do we help the children who, there could be drug addiction at home, alcoholism, parents who have fallen into a deep depression from this, no job, or, money not coming in. How do we help those children to have a safety net?
That is always like the $1 million question. And I think it's like, so yes, we're talking from a place of privilege, but I also think we're fortunate to live in a city like New York that has like programs that are out there, and it is on the forefront of a lot of people. Like the conversation around like mental wellness is happening, right? And that is something that people are aware of. And so it's about linking them with services and just checking in with people that we think are at risk. I mean, I think schools are always like the entry point for mental wellness, right? They haven't always been given the resources, but schools have always seen the signs early on, and they know, and are a great way to identify families that need more support. And so this trick is, I think, to give the schools the ability to make those connections, because there are great programs out there that like are catered to families that need that support. And it's not just the child. Like I will say, I think if you think about this, sometimes it's like the child is the one that like draws the most attention. But typically, I think in these situations, it's the child and the family that need that support. And it's about keeping families together and really linking them all to support services. Like, let's just check in with the child and say they're okay, and then check in and be like, okay, fine, that's great. But like, who's checking in on their parents and who's checking in on them? Because there are services out there for families. It's just making sure that they're connected in the right way. And I think there's the NYC Well hotline, which can be helpful. It's not perfect. I think there's no like perfect system, but there are resources out there, and it's just a matter of like people identifying them and linking them together.
Yeah. I know that there are some schools that have fantastic PTAs and that have looked out, and it's that sense of community, which is now where I want to bring the conversation to, and talking about community, because that was another thing that struck me. So when we were talking, you said you had great concern about what you see in 5 to 10 years in these children and their futures. And I never even thought about that. I mean, I think most of us don't. We think about next day. What do we have to make for dinner tonight or in 2 weeks? But wow, yeah. What is that future without community and where everyone's remote? And you don't think it's there's also that talk that everyone wants to like, now we should all work remotely because we did it and I'm happier at home. But you don't think so, right? You have an opinion?
No, I don't.
Yeah. Tell me why. Tell us.
I think a few things. One, and I want to recognize the fact that I understand it's easier for people with families and children and everything else to be able to have that extra time at home is valuable, right? And I think that is important too. And so it's not to minimize that. But I do think about seeing the reintegration that we've seen among students. I do worry about the long-term consequences of being so isolated and being able to be in our own silos of our networks that we choose to associate with. So it's like the two people at work that we report to, or maybe they report to us, and that's our team, and that's it. But we don't have to bump into have those awkward moments at the coffee maker or the water cooler or something like that. We don't have that moment. And it's in those moments that we really learn to navigate how to live in a diverse society and how we live and interact with people that we wouldn't necessarily will. And we're missing out on that. Because if you're having a bad interaction, you can mute, turn off your cameras, say your Wi-Fi crashed and log off, whatever else. You can do those things. But when you're in person, you can't escape it so easily. And I think that's the beauty of what we're seeing now is the kids struggling through it to get through it. And I am hopeful. I still think there's a lot of work that needs to happen, but I'm hopeful that they will get through it as long as we stick with this idea of having to be back in person. But when I hear talk of people we need to work remotely, I have friends who feel very strong that it's almost become an entitlement that I should be allowed to work from home. And this is something but at what cost to social cohesion? And I think that is hard because yes, we talk about community and everything else, but if we are able to retreat into ourselves and not be forced to work with each other and to really struggle through those uncomfortable moments and awkward moments, then what hope do we have to really build bridges and keep ourselves together as an entire city? Because if you can live in your own section and your own people, then you're never going to experience that discomfort.
No, it's curating your life.
Yeah, well, people lament divisiveness and they how do we come together and everything else, but then they're advocating for these situations, and I'm then when do you have those uncomfortable conversations? How do you come together with somebody that you don't see eye to eye with? How does that work? And I know you never agree with anybody 100% of the time, but I think that it is important to have these in between moments of that can create something and can create change. And you build that bridge. It's harder to dislike somebody that you see every day because of the fact that you hopefully, and maybe I'm romanticizing the idea of human interaction, but I think there's everybody that you see, you can find something good in everybody. And there's something that you can enjoy in that. Maybe you discover that you both take your coffee the same way. I'm all about people who drink their coffee black, and that automatically I was oh, that's great. If I drink my coffee, that's thing. But whatever it is how you can build those bridges with people that you wouldn't necessarily be forced to, or people that you wouldn't necessarily think that you would have a connection to. And so I really do think getting back out there into the world is important for our future as a city, as a country, as a society.
Exactly. So that is kind of what cancel culture is, right? Like just done.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's funny. I was thinking about that too. I was like, and this is maybe because of like my work with adolescents, is that nobody's perfect, right? And we should be allowed to make mistakes. And it feels like some of the shift to cancel culture is like everybody is in this way of like very like, if you see them say one thing out of line, then you're done. Like, I don't know when we moved to that point of like, nobody's allowed to make mistakes. And if you make a mistake, you should be punished forever. And you need to be like boycotted and like taken away. And it's not to say there aren't some things that are egregious, but I do think we need to be nicer to each other, and we need to be able to like say, you know what, maybe their intention wasn't what it seems. Like, how do you have that conversation? Or if you don't have that conversation over Twitter, you're not going to have that conversation on like Snap or like making a TikTok video or anything else. Those aren't places for real dialogue, and real dialogue happens in person. Real dialogue happens face to face, from one-on-one or a small group and whatever else. And so the idea that like we are only going to be remote and do everything virtual further allows us to like only, you see somebody that makes something that bothers you, that makes you uncomfortable, instead of like saying like, hey, can I talk to you about this? I really want to understand where you're coming from. And I really want to like try to help me understand that. And then I'm going to tell you my point of view. That doesn't happen in 140 characters. You can't do that.
And if you have parents that are behaving that way, then what do you expect your kids to? I mean, I see it now more than ever that he picks up all of our behaviors, and it's annoying, and it's always the worst ones, right? And it's like, and you know, and it teaches me. And I know where you teach, and a lot of the schools now have like, you know, a place where if there's an argument, like there's a discussion, like people sit down and do that. I wish we could do that in the real world.
It can happen for adults. I have a friend who works in HR, and I call her like an adult school counselor and stuff like that, because of the fact that like adults don't necessarily behave better because they're older. They need the same types of like forums and ability to be able to talk that out too. And sometimes they need the structures to support that conversation. And workplaces can do that and can be the place to do that if we allow that. We can't just assume everybody's able to like, that has it. And so we need to like be able to support that. But it is very important, I think, for us as a society to be able to have those real dialogues.
You know, I was discussing a lot on climate, and it's COP26 right now, and everyone's out there, and, you know, you look at it and it's the same stuff. It's the same, like, we have got to fix this now or we're all going to die. And the other 50 weeks, it's the same stuff, right? And then those of us in general society who aren't the Secretary General at UN, right? We're President of the United States. We're kind of like looking for people to fix it for us because that's the structure of the government. But I do think that it's all going to come within, and that it's, like you said, small communities and having these discussions and maybe edging out the top tier of that caste system that has been created, and that we'll fix it ourselves. Right? Because we have to deal with that every day. Like they, again, have that privilege and they do whatever, and particularly the senators. But, you know, like you said, I have friends too, you know, who aren't vaccinated, and I have friends who have different political views than I do and all this. And it's very difficult, but they're also my friends. And my aunt's like, well, you can't see them ever again. And it's like, no, you know, we got to like come to a middle and understand, you know, because they got to their opinion somewhere the same way I got, you know, and I don't know, Seth, it's difficult.
If we like stay in this remote way, like how would you ever build those friendships nowadays? Like, I don't even know, how do you build friendships with people that are like so different and have like these disparate views from you? Like, it feels like that's harder. And I think that it's important. Those friendships are super important, but like, there's not the avenues, that there's not the ways to like build that if we're staying remote, if we're doing Zoom classes and you're doing like just communication over Slack and all that stuff, because you're able to disengage in a way and you're not forced through it. So I just think that it's so important to have that. And you're right. Like, I think like with that, I was thinking when you said about climate change, like that's a great example of like the importance of community and connectedness, because of the fact that it is going to impact all of us before it's going to impact any of the senators right now. Right. Like they're going to be okay. All 100 of them are going to be okay, because that's just how that's the way the system works. But it's us living here in New York City that are going to feel the impact a lot sooner and need to come together and be able to do that. Isolation is never the answer. And I think there's a lot of good things that have come over social media and remote and that have can have kept people together that maybe wouldn't. But I think there's an extreme. And I think the pandemic exposed that extreme that we can't swing too far the other way. We can't forego real life human interaction. You can't create that over Zoom in the same way that you can when you have that energy and that physical connectedness that you do there. It's just impossible. And we're seeing that now, right? We're seeing the difficulties of that isolation now and struggling through that.
Yeah. And that you can't see the detection and that you see in person and you could see it on someone's face. That's an excellent point.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So important.
And I think people assume, I think you don't know that you're not okay until you're forced to do something uncomfortable. I think we adjusted and people are like, I'm okay. This is fine. I could do this for everything else. And then now that things are coming back, it's oh, now I realize I wasn't okay then. And now I need more support and I need help. But you don't know that until you're pushed a little bit out.
I have a lot of friends who are dealing with social interaction right now and not sure how to come back. We sit and we go out to dinner. But what I do love about this time is that I think people are speaking about things more and feel someone who I wouldn't say who I would ever think would be open emotionally like that, admittedly said, this is a big deal for me right now, just sitting here.
Right. And I think that's great that we have that people feel that is fantastic. And we have to talk about it more and we have to create more opportunities for people to have those experiences and the space to be able to talk about it and share how this is feeling for me in the moment. It will get better. It will get easier and it will get better. And I think but it is so important. But I also think that we've come to realize that people need a little bit of a push too at times. So.
Yeah. And mirror that for our children.
Yes. Be open. I think that's really important. One thing I try to do in my own life, in my own practice is just being genuine. The idea that people think oh, you have everything together. People will say kids don't have a most accurate perception. Sometimes they're very perceptive. Other times they imagine things that aren't there, but they think that's the idea that you have everything together. And it's no, be honest with the fact that I have this one piece together, but there's a whole, there's 3 other pieces over here that are just really messy. And that's okay because I'm going to get through that. But it's just being open and genuine and being sincere in all your interactions. That counts for a lot. And I have found that people appreciate when you're sincere and your authentic self. They find strength in that and they respond positively towards that. So
100%. And I love that you are so authentic in that you can just talk to you about anything. And I'm sure that the kids appreciate that as well, right?
Well, and I appreciate that in them too. It is a privilege to do what I do. So,
well, we're at the end, and that's, where I was going to say that I have several friends and family teaching and leading in public school, and we're public school parents. And first, I want to thank you for all that you do, because it's like you're working for a nonprofit. I know you're not getting paid a lot, Seth, and I know that, it is. It's like a volunteer position. You're on 24/7, and it takes a lot out of you. And I think people need to just really sit back and, again, community, appreciate that and walk in each other's shoes and just take a moment, right? But what gets you up every day? You could leave and you could just go take an easier gig, right? What keeps you going, Seth? And what keeps you waking up every morning and wanting to be the change for our public school children?
Well, it's funny. We started talking about community, and I think it really is about community. The thing I love most about my job is that I feel connected to people in a way I've never felt before in other jobs I've had, right? And I think that's the thing. And it's about getting to see people every morning and seeing how they are and helping them and learning about their life and learning their stories and hopefully making things a little bit better, because they make my life better, hearing from others and being exposed to different experiences and scenarios and stuff like that. It's really great. And families are amazing. And it's just so nice to have that exposure and to feel super connected to New York City in a way that I don't think you get if you're not working in a school. And so maybe more people should come work in a school and you feel really connected, which is great. It's a privilege to be able to work with families and their children and hopefully make this awkward time of life a little less painful.
Well, you do, Seth. I can say that you absolutely do. So thank you so much for being a change and doing it every single day. We're going to finish with how can people, you mentioned, is it New York City Well, if you are struggling or if you know of your kids struggling, what are some of the resources people can go to?
So NYC Well has like an online thing. It's through Thrive NYC. You can go on there and you can search through your insurance company and Radius and everything else. I also think like if you have a primary care doctor, that is a great resource. They have a lot of referrals that they can make too as well. That's a really good thing. And I know people are always like family and friends, but don't be afraid to ask your like friend. I like love my therapist so much and I tell everybody about that. So it's like okay to like ask that people like, I'm really like having a hard time or I really don't know what I'm doing. My son is really struggling or my daughter and everything else, and just be like, ask them too. So I think those are some really great resources. I mean, if you have insurance, then your insurance directory is one place else, but NYC Well is a really good starting off point. And
don't be afraid to reach out to your school's guidance counselor and check in on your kid, right? To see how they're doing.
I mean, and not just your guidance counselor. I think teachers more so than ever are attuned to our kids' emotional well-being, and they really do care, and they see things that counselors and you don't see because they see them in a very different way. So reach out to your teachers too and just say, hey, is everything okay? Or do you notice anything? They know it, and they're dedicated, and they're trying to make this transition as easy as possible too, for not just for the students, but for their families. So
wonderful. Well, thank you, Seth, and thank you for being the change.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation and are inspired. We grow with supporters and listeners like you. So please share this podcast with your community and follow us on Instagram at bethechange.nyc. And to learn more about our guests and what you can do to be the change, go to our website at www.bethechange.nyc. That's bethechange.nyc. Thank you and be well.